Yo, so today I'm going to be breaking down a bouncy melody for someone like Lil Uzi and then throwing some drums on it at the end. Alright, so for the first sounds in the melody, I used two plucks to kind of get the base of the melody going. So the first one is the Stargazed pluck from the Eclipse Serum Bank, and then the second one is a key called Shorty from Sunboy's Hypnosis Bank, and both of these are just really solid sounding plucks or keys, and they just fit really well together. Alright, so then here's the MIDI for both of those plucks, and as you can see, it looks like a pretty complex pattern, but really it's just a 2-bar loop that repeats for the rest of the time. If I were to go ahead and make something similar, we would start off by picking a scale, so I'm going to go with D sharp minor, and then we're just going to make a simple repeating bass pattern. And then for the second part, we're just going to put it up to F. And then to make this seem more full, we're going to go ahead and grab the 7. So in D sharp minor using D sharp, that would be C sharp. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. And then we're going to go ahead and skip a couple. So there's a little bit of variation in there. And then we can go ahead and do the same thing with that F chord. So we're going to put it up to D sharp this time because that's the 7th for that chord if I did fill it out. So now that we have that going, it already has a little bit of bounce because of the breaks in the top notes. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of fill this out and make a little top line. So I'm just going to go ahead and add some top notes. Then we can just go ahead and do a little ascending pattern here. So that's already sounding pretty good, but I do want to make it more bouncy, so I'm going to go ahead and add more breaks into the pattern, just so it sounds a little bit more interesting. So how I did that in the original melody is going ahead and shortening this and just moving this over. So now that chord kind of hits you by surprise and there's a little bit of a break there, so it just adds a little bit more bounce and overall just makes it sound a little bit cooler. So then again, we're kind of doing that same thing here with the pause, except it's only using the top line and not pausing in the chord. So normally this A sharp should hit here and it would sound like more natural. But since we're going to move that over 2 little cells, it's just going to give a little bit of a break and just create a little bit of bounce. And then we're just going to kind of do that same process over in the first half again, just to again kind of just fill it out and add a little bit of bounce. So that's pretty much how I come up with these kind of patterns, and I would do a lot of extra stuff if it wasn't for the time constraint that I have on videos. But this is really how I come up with the base of it, and then I'll just kind of build further off here and just kind of make it more complex and add in more little breaks to just give it a little bit more bounce. So if we go ahead back and look at the main MIDI for the melody, you can see that I ended up pitching that up to B minor. And then if we go in and look at this further, you can see that all of the breaks that I was talking about earlier are in it. So you can see that this chord is offset and it's also using that same top note that I demonstrated when I broke this down from scratch. And then I went ahead and made the top line a little bit more complex. So then, like I mentioned before, this is the MIDI for the key and it's the exact same thing, so there's really not much explaining to do here. So then after I had those two MIDIs figured out, I went ahead and routed it through this effect chain. So to start off with, I have Shaper Box on the same wave preset, Halftime on the 1 bar preset with the smoothing turned to the FX side, Valhalla Supermassive on the default preset with the delay turned to 8th note, a Fruity Love Filter on the simple triangle low pass LFO, and then finally a low cut just to make room for an 808, and then an imager just to make it feel really nice and wide. So then after that, here's what it looks like all rendered out, and you can see that I did add some automation clips and additional effects. But the main thing I wanted to mention before I break the additional effects down is that on this bottom pluck that was the shorty key, I went ahead and double clicked on it and changed the declicking mode to smooth, so it has a little bit of a fade out. Then I made these chops and dragged them back half a cell, so it gives it a super pulsing feel, and overall again just kind of adds a little bit more bounce. So then for the additional effects on those, I started off with adding D Blue Crusher, which is a free crushing plugin on the reduction at 2 samples, Portal on the Flutter Clouds preset, which is automated, again another Supermassive just on the default preset with the delay at 300 milliseconds, an EQ just to kind of cut out a little bit of the low mids, an EQ again to just cut out the lows to make room for an 808, and then finally an imager again just to make it a little bit wider. And then on the second one, I have another Fruity Love Filter just on the default preset with the cut knob automated, an EQ that basically does the same thing as the last one where it cuts out of the low mids, an EQ to completely cut the lows, and then finally a Pancake on the Opponents preset, and I went ahead and changed the LFO to half and the mix down to 33%. So really in this melody, a lot of the effects do most of the work, work. So the main one would be Supermassive, which is a free plugin, and it's really great, and it just adds a super nice sparkle and just a massive delay to it. So here's what it sounds like when you combine both of them together. So then for the next sound, it's a mallet, and I just wanted to use this to accent the melody. So it's a mallet called Ring from Sunboy's Quadrabank, and overall it's just a really solid sound that you can add Supermassive to, and it sounds really interesting. So then here's the MIDI for it, and overall this is pretty simple. So I went ahead and started off by just copying the bass note, so you can see B is the bass note, and then we moved to D, but I just went ahead and put this B up an octave just to make it a little bit more interesting. And then for the rest of the things in this MIDI, being the rolls, it just copies a normal chord. So then you can see B, D, and then F sharp, which would make it just a normal triad in B minor. And then for this roll, I just kind of copied a bunch of notes in the scale and moved things around till it sounded right. So like I mentioned, for the effects on this, I started off with Supermassive just on the default preset with the delay at 300 milliseconds. Then I added another crusher, but this time the reduction is at 4 samples and the smoothing is at 20%. And then finally I added another love filter, but this time it's at the step pyramid low pass preset. So after I made the MIDI and added those effects, here's what it ends up sounding like. And then for the next sounds in the melody, it's 3 leads that all kind of work together. So the first one is a pluck called Contrabass Flute, but it really behaves more like a lead. The second one is a lead called Candy from, again, Sunboy's Quadrabank. And then the final lead is called Whole Lotta Red, and this is from Sunboy's Hypnosis Bank. And all of these leads just kind of fit well together, with the exception of the Whole Lotta Red lead that really stands out in the melody. So then here's the MIDI for the first lead, that's that flute lead. And I just went ahead and copied random things in the scale and did these little sliding patterns. And then again, I kind of copied that roll from the accent pluck that just copies a normal triad, and it just goes up the scale to just kind of give a little accent bit. So overall, this melody is super simple, and the only variation in it is this second half is pushed up an octave, which is just really subtle, but it does give a little bit of variation. So then here's the MIDI for the second lead called Candy, and really I just have this playing whenever the first one isn't, so they kind of bounce back and forth. And when I go over the effects, you'll see that they pretty much have the exact same effects, so they almost kind of blend together and just kind of accent off of each other. And then for the final lead, which is that Whole Lotta Red lead, this is the lead that really stands out because it's a lot harsher from the other two ones, and I also have it playing a lot busier of a pattern. So if we go ahead and look at the MIDI, there's really no breaks in this except for this little section here where there should be the rest of the roll, but these rolls just kind of copy notes in the scale, and it's also kind of that same thing where it's copying a normal B chord. So I went ahead and copied the roll from the flute pattern and then just kind of pasted that over here, inversed it so it's going downwards instead of upwards, and just copy that over a bunch of times. The only variation I have in this melody is the second half is up an octave, but these bass rolls still stay the same. So then for the effects on those 3 sounds, on the flute lead, I have a fruity reverb with the pre-delay turned up, the decay turned up, and then the wet slider turned up, and then a gross beat on the half beat gate, and then I also threw the basic 8 preset on there for a little bit of reverse at the end. Next for the Candy lead, and like I mentioned before, these effects are kind of the same. So I started off with that same reverb preset with the pre-delay turned up, the decay turned up, and then the wet slider turned up a little bit. Then again, like the last sound, I added a half beat gate, but this one isn't as messed up and there's no basic 8 preset. Finally, I just add an EQ to really filter it out so it really sits in the background and just kind of fills up a bit of space. Then for the final lead, which is the Whole Lotta Red lead, I went ahead and added this EQ to boost the low mids and cut out of the highs as well as the lows. And then finally, I went ahead and added that reverb preset with the pre-delay turned up, but the decay isn't as high this time. And then I actually forgot to mention 2 things about these leads. So if we go here and look at the playlist, you can see that I have an automation clip on the Candy lead, and it just makes it so the half beat gate only comes on after the lead is done playing, so it's a little bit nicer and it's not gated the entire time. The other thing I forgot to mention is I made a simpler pattern of the Whole Lotta Red lead, so it's just the bass rolls and they're a little bit slower. So overall, these 3 lead patterns really just fit and mesh well together, so here's what they sound like. So then for the final sound of the melody, we have a bass, and I made this myself in Serum, and it's called Buzz, and it has a little bit of a buzzing sound to it, so I thought it added a really nice texture to the melody as well as giving it some low end. And then here's the MIDI for that, and it's a bass, so it just copies the bass notes, so there's really not much explaining to do here. So here's what it ends up sounding like. And then for the effects on that, I just have 2 EQs. So here's the first one, and it just kind of cuts out a little bit of the buzzing because it was super overbearing, and this makes it a little bit more manageable, where it just adds a nice little texture. And then for the second EQ, it just kind of boosts the lows and then cuts out of some of the mids. So that's it for all the melodic sounds in the melody, but then I did add a bunch of drum loops and textures that I went ahead and chopped up, and all of these are from my upcoming one-shot kit that should come out sometime next month. So here's what all of those sound like together. So then finally, after adding those textures, the only other thing I changed was I upped the BPM to 130, and I actually made this at 129, so just made it a little bit faster, and then I ended up pitching it down one to A sharp minor. So here's what it sounds like. So overall, I've really been having fun making these kind of melodies, so now we can go ahead and get started on the drums. Alright, so that's going to be pretty much it for the video, and I'm pretty happy with how the drums turned out. I've really started to improve with drums, oddly, just because I've been making like type beats more consistently and posting them like 3 times a week, I think. But hopefully I'll get back to that with tutorials being more consistent. But I got into Blender, and then that like no like making loops for a good amount of time. I was just learning Blender. I'm so bad at it, but it's really fun. I don't know. I'm gonna use it for a cover art for the next kit. It's gonna be pretty sick. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for watching. Yeah, have a great rest of your morning, and bye.